Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome back to our webinar series. Today we have Jorge Javillas with Canada West Lands and a group of other presenters that he'll introduce speaking about Indigenous relations and COVID-19, adapting protocols during a pandemic. I'd like to thank H3M for sponsoring today. And helping me and arrange this. Thank you to Carolyn for making this all come together. Thanks for your work. Thanks to all the presenters for speaking. Later today, once the video is processed, you'll receive a video link, an email with a link to the video for today's recording, so you can watch it back again if you missed any parts of it. We have another webinar coming up in next week, so you can check that out at isa.org/webinars. And we have REMTech in 2 weeks. Encourage you to sign up for that. 63 presentations over a couple days. Check it out. It's only $99 for members and $119 for non-members, so check that out. So I'm going to turn it over to our presenters and they can get started. So just give me a second. Jorge, you should have a message on your screen. Okay, and just so everyone knows, I'll pop out and I'll be back when there's questions, whether at the end or if something comes up in between. I'll turn this over because it's gonna be kind of like a panel discussion for the 2 hours, so I'll let you go.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So welcome everybody. This is to me it's a real honor to be able to lead this conversation today. This is a conversation that is dear to my heart. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to do a land acknowledgement. And not only, usually when I do this, I acknowledge not only the land from where I am speaking, but I also like to acknowledge the people whose territory or whose treaty land in this case is. And so I like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the peoples of the Treaty 7 region here in Southern Alberta. I'm talking to you from Calgary. And these are the lands of the Blackfoot First Nations, which are Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai tribes, the Stoney Nakoda Nation, and there we have also 3 beautiful communities, Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley, and then the Tsuut'ina Nation. And also this area is the traditional land to the Northwest Métis people, specifically the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. And because I'm not even born Canadian, I am a true settler in that sense because I haven't been born here. And so I always acknowledge the gratitude and the welcoming attitude of our Indigenous people in this area to people like me. So I know how important this is to everybody. It is to me too. I love this adopted country of mine. And the other thing that we thought would be very appropriate, as you can see, most of us are wearing orange today, and that's in recognition of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. This is the Orange Day. It was instituted as one of the 94 recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it has to do with the story of this girl who, when she joined the residential school in central BC, she was asked to get rid of the orange shirt that her grandmother had given her for her first day of school. So in conversation, we not only celebrate the fact that things like residential schools are no longer a reality, a sad reality in Canada, but we also recognize that by remembering events like this, we remind ourselves of the value behind the lesson. And in this case, it's that all children, in fact, all human beings should be treated equally and are to be honored for who they are. So all children are the same value. If you would like more information on this, I would encourage you to Google Orange Shirt Day to find out more about it. There's all sorts of events and initiatives taking place around that. So what I would like to do first, this is the agenda for today. It's going to be a very open conversation. I'm going to introduce you in a minute to the panelists who are friends of mine, some from way long back, others not so long ago. But these are people that I deem to be real authorities in their own field when it comes to protocol. Some of the panel members are Indigenous, some of them are not, and we come to the table not just with our individual knowledge, but we come with our own perspective and our own lack of knowledge. So what I'm hoping we will do today is we will be able to have a conversation to learn from one another, to establish where this idea of protocol and disruption of protocol comes from, and how we can address it and start a communication so that we can all learn from this. And so whenever we get into a portion of the webinar where there is questions or it's open to questions, we'll do both. We'll have questions, but we'll also like to hear if you have something that you think would be of value for everybody to hear. We would invite you to send messages through the internal message system. You should have it on your screen if you're using the same program. So we invite you to send all those comments to us so that we can actually share them with the rest of the people. And the reason why I do this is because protocol changes, sometimes slightly, sometimes quite drastically from one experience to the next. So the idea is that we learn about the concept of protocol and we learn from one another about our own personal experience in protocol. So we'll go back to the agenda, but first of all, well, you've met me. I'll tell you very little about myself. I am originally from Argentina. I was born in Argentina. My parents were settlers there from Spain. They had moved from Spain during the Civil War. And so I am an immigrant son of immigrants, so a settler son of settlers, but elsewhere. And as such, I've always been fascinated by different cultures and cross-cultural communication. I've worked in many countries around the world, primarily just about all of Latin America, many countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and it had to do all with sustainable development and Indigenous relations, cross-cultural communications. So I have a fairly broad perspective when it comes to protocol, and I'll find the time to maybe share with you some of the interesting protocols that I've encountered while traveling the world. The next person that I would like to introduce is Holly Fortier. Holly Fortier, although she's very young, has been my friend for many years. I love Holly with all my heart. Holly is Indigenous herself, and maybe if you're unmuted, Holly, I'll let you introduce yourself and maybe greet people from where you are.
Yeah, so thank you, Jorge, for inviting me to the panel. I'm Holly Fortier from I'm from Fort McKay First Nation. So my community is actually ground zero of the third largest oil field in the world, just north of Fort McMurray. We are Cree and Dene in our community and Métis in our community. And I'm actually at my cottage in during this pandemic here, so it's really nice to be able to speak virtually. I do Indigenous awareness training. I did 3 Orange Shirt panel discussions, webinars this morning. It's really beautiful. So just the last one was 300 people. So this conversation is really beautiful. And I'm also a filmmaker. I did a documentary on my mom's Indian residential school story and perhaps we can send it to you later. It's just a short documentary, about 13 minutes, but it's the voice of a survivor and the legacy of that. And so, yeah, that's it for me. Thank you,
Right
Jorge.
on. No, thanks, Holly. I really appreciate it. Next, we have Scott Miller. And Scott, I'll let you introduce yourself. There's not much I can say about you, but I find your story very interesting as well. So if you're with us and your connection with Wi-Fi is good, go ahead and tell us something about yourself. Oh, I think we lost him. Yeah, he's very, very buried in the middle of no wave land. So maybe we'll come back to Scott. Lisa, can you talk to us and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So my name's Lisa Johnson, and I actually live in Fort St. John and have for the last 25 years. I'm originally from Ontario, and I can't believe I've lived up here for that long, so I feel grateful for such a long career up here. I'm an archaeologist and also very feel quite akin to the Indigenous cultures up here. I'm from Ontario, and I did concentrated on First Nation studies, Canadian First Nation studies, and I feel really honored to be part of this panel today.
Right on. Thanks, Lisa. So before we get into the final aim of our chat today, I wanted to establish a regular knowledge, or maybe start a conversation about protocol. And so because I speak several languages, I am a total geek. I'm a language geek. My kids would tell you this anytime, that I'm constantly correcting them, because the meaning of words is very important, especially orally, right? So with words and the way that we speak and the words we choose to use when we communicate, we can build people or destroy them. So that the meaning of words and the choice of words is very important. And so before we get into this idea of what protocol is, because sometimes we have different concepts, right? Different understandings of the meaning of a word. Even, when you go to the dictionary, different dictionaries will actually give you different meanings for the word protocol. Most people will actually talk about this idea, or most dictionaries will talk about this idea of a sheet of paper that was put in front of a document, indicating what inside of the document was. And that comes from the origin of the word, which is Greek. And protocol means, proto means in front of or before, and col or column in that original language meant glued, and it was because that piece of paper was glued. But we don't really use that meaning anymore, even though many dictionaries use it. So the meaning of the word protocol nowadays could be several there as used, and I mean, as far as language use goes, the most common one is a set of preset standards or steps taken to acknowledge the position of somebody or a group of people or a place to show respect, right? So there are certain orders. So for instance, when IT borrowed the word protocol, they borrowed it because when you do IT protocol, you're actually following a set of or preset of list of steps to take in order to have a program work, etc. So as we use it today, there is many things that we do, for instance, on our everyday lives that could be used as, or could be classified as protocol, even though we don't really see it as protocol. But what we really are here to do is focus more on Indigenous protocol. But as we start sharing maybe our experiences, we can talk about some of the other protocols that we see every day, not only in non-Indigenous settings, but in our own settings that maybe we don't consider protocol. But before we do that, maybe what I'll do is I'll ask you, Holly, to give me an impression of what your idea of protocol, what does the word protocol mean to you as an Indigenous person?
Well, it's such a great conversation because I feel that, you know, when I'm working, for example, in my community, and we have groups coming in, industry, businesses, government agencies. And the other thing is when I'm working across the nation and I'm going into their world, I always, you know, say that there are differences, because even though, you know, First Nation or Métis community may be just down the road across the river over there, it still is a nation within a nation, and there are cultural differences. So, you know, how you travel and you know, you don't want to be that tacky tourist. You just find out, you know, what the difference is. And I always say to people, if you could just like do a little bit of research. I know we have infinity in our pocket. You know, we can research. And when we're working with Indigenous peoples, communities, businesses, I always give the suggestion of just look, listen, learn before you move forward, because I really believe the #1 rule is to build a relationship, to take the time to build a rapport, because if you put relationship before business, your business goes further. And I honestly can't stress that enough, because I've had so many people, you know, come into our community, and you can spot them where they're just like, they just want to like check a box, right? And they just, and we can tell the difference when people come in and want to build a relationship, and they take that time to do that. So this is such an important conversation, and I would say that is the #1 rule, is the relationship building.
Right, right on. That's a great answer. Thank you so much. So I love your image of, you know, not being that tacky tourist, and sometimes that's a great way to exemplify what you're doing. You know, you don't want to be just a tourist. You want to make sure that that you do things properly, that you follow the protocol or the social standards that are followed in any given place, right? In any given community. So, you know, as we're talking, you know, we can think of working around the world. I run into so many places where still today it is appropriate, for instance, for a man to ask for the hand of a girl or a woman that he's intending to marry. And the reason being is not because they're afraid or because they're old-fashioned. It's because by asking for the hand of the person they intend to marry, they're actually acknowledging that their parents have seniority over her. So there is this, all you're doing is you're actually acknowledging the seniority and the respect that the parents of the person you want to marry have. So that's a very clear example. While many groups don't think about, is this still necessary or not, in many societies, that's still very, very, very important. When you go into a grocery store in a small town in France, even though you might not know anybody there, you still say, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You make sure that you greet everybody. It's something that you wouldn't do necessarily in our setting, but those types of protocols are the ones that open doors or build walls. So the second you identify yourself as not belonging by not following protocol, you're thickening that wall, that cross-cultural wall that might be built in there. I wonder if maybe, Scott, if you're there, since you didn't get a chance to speak earlier, maybe you can give us an example, one or two examples of protocols that you've run into working in BC. Maybe you're still having issues with connectivity. Lisa, can you think of a couple of examples?
Yeah. Oh, there he is.
Oh, are you there, Scott?
I am finally, yes.
Oh, right on. Awesome. So sorry, Lisa, I'll get back to you in a minute. Scott, do you want to give us a couple of examples of work? And maybe you can introduce yourself first, since you didn't get a chance a minute ago, and give us a sample or two of protocols that you run into while working in BC.
So thanks for that, and I apologize for the internet. I'm out here in the hinterland of rural Alberta, it seems, when it comes to internet at least. I'm Scott Miller. I'm the principal and owner of this new little company that I've sort of started off called Collaboration Dynamics. And I had a long history of working with the government and with the Alberta Energy Regulator on a number of different sort of big projects. And that's where actually I got most of my exposure and awareness of some of the protocol used with Indigenous communities. And I think I'll leave my introduction at that just because I know we're already into the discussion. In terms of some of the best examples of protocol or how I was, I guess, introduced into this world, because it's not a space that I've gone into over the long haul. Like when you talk about my work in BC, that was mostly doing fisheries work. And so it's only when I came into Alberta and I started to work with a number of communities through the Alberta Energy Regulator up in the Fox Creek area. And I had a wonderful elder named Percy Potts, who in effect took me under his wing a little bit and helped me through some of the work we were doing. And I learned a great deal. And interestingly, one of the things that stuck with me probably the most out of that discussion was, some of our protocol was, he had indicated that the protocol we were undertaking was between me and the creator, not, it wasn't intended for, sharing with friends necessarily, other than to say that I had participated. But I have to say it was as an introduction to protocol and what it was and what it meant. It certainly changed how I see things, and I actually spent a good deal of time working to get the Alberta Energy Regulator to think along the lines of what protocol is intended to do, which is to sort of set the stage and, as Holly said, sort of build a relationship. Anyway, I'll leave it there and go with that.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. Lisa, did you want to add your own example of maybe one protocol or something related to protocol that you've encountered?
Yeah, so in my career up in the northern BC area, I've had the honor of working with many of the Treaty A communities and on multiple projects with participation with in archaeological projects. And the one thing I've once again would love to reiterate as well that Holly mentioned is the relationship building. That was very important to me in relationship building with all the communities, and really understanding that I'm a visitor too, and that they are able to disseminate their concerns or issues. And I've had the pleasure of working with quite a few elders from the communities as well. And like Scott said, always knowing the creator. So when I go out to communities, I always like to bring, meeting with any community member, like to bring something, whether a tobacco offering or I've learned the recipe of how to make a really good chagas tea. So that sort of thing, but definitely relationship building for sure.
That's awesome. Yeah. So we've all had the same level of exposure to this, right? Which, you know, right on this slide, we have this idea of shareability, and I've put it on quotation marks because it really it is something very, very personal. Protocol is something that you should learn primarily from the people that follow that protocol, or from the people that originated, or right, or that practice that protocol on a regular basis. It's okay to be introduced to certain ideas by other people that have experienced it too, but I think that the best, this is what I liked about your comments, Scott, is that it's something very personal, and it's a protocol that you follow with the creator. And it's basically not just out of social respect or social etiquette that you do it. It's actually out of respect, and respect, by respect I mean a true acknowledgement that how other people think, or how other people feel, or how other people live should have the same value, or should be respected for the same value that you give to your own practices or beliefs, etc. So when we get into analyzing what the importance of protocol, understanding the value not only that it brings to the relationship building, but that brings to communicating to the people that you're trying to form a relationship with, that you respect them. Protocol and learning, wanting to learn, not just reciting things by heart, but really indicating that this means something to you, that respect means something to you, is very, very important. Now, before we change and go into the next slide, I'd like to maybe start introducing this idea of flexibility, because certain protocols around the world change in level of flexibility depending on the community that you live in. So for instance, just to give you a very clear example that everybody will understand, is you can't really generalize and say that all Islamic people require the covering of the head when among females, right? So that changes not only in degrees of how much the head needs to be covered, it also changes among, you know, when it is appropriate to cover your head and when it's not. So in the same way, there is, you can't really talk about one single protocol that applies to all First Nations or to all Indigenous people, because there are certain different levels of flexibility that people will have. Sometimes the levels of flexibility come because Indigenous people, or the people that hold the protocol, the people that own the protocol, understand that those of us who are not Indigenous sometimes fall short of meeting that protocol. And so, you know, like you, Scott, I had the privilege of working with some elders all over the place, not just in Canada, all over the place. And they were committed to being next to me, telling me ahead of time what was appropriate, what was not. And what I find is that if you ask the right questions before you make the mistake, the conversation goes way more smoothly, and people are willing to be more flexible with you, or forgive faux pas that you might make. You know, I'll give you a quick example. I was introduced. I worked for years and years with Stoney Nakoda nations. Great community. They were some of the people that introduced me to Alberta's Indigenous culture. The closest I had my very first sweat lodge with the Stoney Nakoda. I was invited by them. They taught me how to do the photo protocol for water ceremonies, for instance, etc. And I did many pipe ceremonies with them. And some people spin the pipe before they pass it along to the next person in the circle. And I was sitting at a circle once that had people from several different First Nations, and some of them were Stony, but there were also some Cree people and there were some Blackfoot people in the circle as well. And the elder sitting to my right, who was going to be smoking the pipe before it was passed to me, was Blackfoot. And he knew that I might be in a tough position of not knowing what to do when the pipe got to me. So he leaned over and whispered in my ear, "Do not spin the pipe." And that was so, I mean, it was almost funny, but, and he smiled at me, but he knew ahead of time that I might be making a mistake. So he actually introduced me to the standard and introduced me to that level of flexibility that that protocol was going to have. I wonder if, Holly, you can talk a little bit more about levels of flexibility in protocol in your experience. I mean, you're Indigenous, but you live in both worlds, right? So you live in community, but you also are an ambassador outside of the Indigenous world to us settlers on what is there. Is there a thought about flexibility and protocol that you'd like to share with us?
Well, thanks for saying that I'm ambassador. That's a compliment. I just have to giggle at your flexibility with the pipe comment, because I love it when people are like they see a blunder coming and they'll just kind of like guide you in their gentleness, and I love that. And I've made many mistakes myself in ceremony, and I just want to say, if you make mistakes, be gentle on yourself. Like, there's no perfect person. Don't beat yourself up. Be gentle on yourself, and just, when we know better, we do better, right? But I have to say, there's 634 First Nations in Canada on 3,100 Indian reserves, and 60 different language groups, and all of Canada's traditional territory, and we overlap in our territories. Of course, when Jorge gave the land acknowledgement, there's many people in the territory where we're doing business right now, and we have to be really careful that we don't pan-indigenize, where we're just saying, that'd be like me. My son lives in the Netherlands, and I went to Rotterdam, and I say, well, I've been to Rotterdam, I know Europe. And I know that sounds silly, but people actually do that. They actually come into the community and go, well, I've worked with Mohawks Montreal, and this is what we did. And I was like, we're not Mohawks Montreal. And even if you've worked with, in my community is Cree and Dene people, and we have Métis in my community too. People come in and say, well, I've worked with Cree, Dene, Métis. It doesn't matter. Every community has a different way in which it wants to be approached, and just, to find out like what is the proper, way of doing things, and to be flexible. I mean, we could be, and I'm First Nation, but I don't go into another nation going, well, I know what's going on. I don't. And I've learned to just really pay attention, and like Jorge said, just to like learn the differences and to be flexible. So I love that story, and I love that you brought this up, because this is important in protocol, because so many times people say, well, if I'm going into a community, I have to bring, what, maybe they have a list, right? Tobacco and this and that and this. No, you should do your homework. Is there honorariums? How much? Maybe there's no honorariums. Maybe they don't like honorariums. Maybe honorariums are expected. So, we really just have to realize that everywhere you go is going to be different, and every community, every individual, every business that you're working with is different.
Right. That's a really good thought, and that's exactly what comes to mind, especially when you worked with several different cultures and community. The more diverse the group of people that you work with, the more you learn that you have to really not make any assumptions, that you have to be prepared to learn. No matter how many times you've done it before, you have to be ready to learn. But just to tie it back to the initial concept that we were talking about, the stronger a relationship between you and any given group or members of a group, the more flexible the protocol becomes, the more forgiving it becomes, because people then understand that your intentions are real, that your intentions are still of honoring and respecting people. A clear example I'll give you, for instance, I worked for several years with a major indigenous group that crosses northern Vietnam and Laos and parts of Thailand, and they're called the Hmong people. And the Hmong people, like most Southeast Asia communities, are not very physical at all. They don't touch one another. And I'm Latin, so I grew up, being kissed by everybody and hugged by everybody and touched by everybody. I feel it very, very comfortable. So I had to be very, very careful not to touch or look directly straight in the eye at the people that I was working with at the beginning. And one of the most common ways for people to greet is they put their hands together in front of their mouth, and that, like you're about to pray, and they'll make a little head bow just to show respect, and that's a way of greeting. By the time I was done with projects in that community, people would come to me and do their traditional bowing of the head with the hands in front of their mouths, but immediately after they would hug me. And that just showed that they were prepared to speak my language too, right? So the protocol was very personal, because they knew that by touching physically that we were not really disrespecting one another. It was just a show that we were, in fact, appreciating each other's protocols or histories. This is a great conversation, but this leads us into, and Holly, you said something about being able to open our minds so that we can learn protocols. So right now, what I'd like to do is just maybe invite all people in the panel, and we'll start maybe with Lisa about, so what do you think it's necessary to learn protocol? And if people have comments or questions while we're talking, please feel free to start jotting them down, because we're going to pick some of those comments or questions to enrich the conversation too. Lisa, do you want to take it away?
Sure. I definitely I have followed the ask questions, because I've never been afraid when I don't know something, and I would rather have a community member inform me of what the protocol is before I do make a mistake too, and always just out of respect. It's been a long time to build relationships, and like anything, relationships do not come overnight, and they take time, and they're worth it when you take the time and the genuine interest in building them.
Right, that's very good. So it's just a sign that you care, right? That you care about other people. Scott, any ideas on how to learn protocol?
Aside from that sort of question, that open question kind of approach, it often strikes me that you have to go into it with the right mindset as well, and understand, at least I can look at it in hindsight and say, it helped to go in with a mindset of being actually curious about the protocol, about being understanding how it fit, and be open to the really new things that come about because of it. So the example I would give would be in some of the ceremony sessions that I did with Percy. He picked up on some things and followed up with me afterwards. Actually, was trying to provide me with guidance sort of beyond what we were talking about, because he was picking up on some really deep understandings, I guess it might be. So it's interesting how through one vehicle you get so many different sort of ways to proceed. I guess it goes to the relationship building, but it just strikes me that you have to be open and willing to take those roads when they come available.
And also understand that different people, because of their upbringing and their culture, etc., have different levels of understanding or different values, that apply to that protocol. So many times, for instance, if I don't understand something that goes on in a protocol and I have a relationship that allows me to do this, I will actually ask, so what is the value in doing this? What am I exemplifying by doing this, or what am I showing by following this protocol? And a clear example of that is, when you compare nowadays the way, for instance, that elderly people are not revered in the same way by different groups or by different societies, right? So in some stereotypical North American society, older people, when they become needy or they need to be looked after, you put them in a home, for instance, in an elderly home. And that's the kind of stuff that you would never see, for instance, in the society that I was raised. Older people are looked after, they usually live with one relative, or and you want your kids to spend as much time as possible with their grandparents, because they know that they've lived long enough to learn patience and to learn, to be a source of knowledge and of stories, of anecdotes. One of the greatest memories I have of my upbringing is having my paternal grandmother tell us stories of when she was a little girl and how she learned, to live, to farm, etc., when she lived in Spain. That is priceless. That's absolutely priceless. And yet not everybody sees it that way, right? So when you encounter a different protocol or a different set of values towards something, it's really important, as you say, Scott, that we keep that open mind and we don't lose respect, because sometimes what happens is we tend to assume an ethnocentric position and think that the way we were brought up or the way that we were taught is the only way or the best way. And that's really the number one mistake you can make. A clear example of this, I have a friend who practices Indigenous law, or did, in New Zealand for years, and she had done a case in Ecuador with a group of Indigenous people that believed that the souls of their ancestors lived inside of big trees, in the trunks of big trees. So when a company came there to start doing some foresting and cutting wood, they obviously took the case to court. And the American company that was trying to cut the trees in front of the judge asked the Indigenous people if they had some scientific proof that their ancestors lived inside of the trees. And the chief of this one particular band, without hesitation, stood up and said, "Do you have any scientific proof that they don't?" And that was the end of the discussion, right? So being open-minded in the conversation is very, very important. Is there somebody trying to make a comment?
I sent you a couple questions, Jorge. It's Joe.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know if you can see them on your screen, but one is the protocol just for face-to-face contact in the community. How do you navigate protocol in the digital space?
Aha. So yeah, so there we start getting into some of the flexibility issues, and we'll treat them more in detail further down. But that's a very, very good question. Sometimes, like we're going to address COVID as a specific example. But when, for instance, let's say it's not COVID, but it's bad weather, and now we have the advantage of being able to do it over the phone, of talking to people over the phone, or being able to speak like we're speaking today over the cyberspace, then you have to make sure that whatever protocol you follow still meets the values and the significance that any given protocol gives to a conversation. So, for instance, right now I'm doing a course. I teach a course. I'm part of the faculty at the Banff Center, and I love their Indigenous leadership program, and I've done, Holly and I have done a few courses together there. Right now, because of COVID, all the classes in person are stopped, but we still have an elder lead us in prayer before every class. And then in the smaller groups, we still do things like, for instance, we can prepare to smudge separately if that's of meaning to you. If you think that smudging is the portion of the protocol that you cannot live without, then the person leading the opening prayer or leading the opening of the class will smudge, and then people, as they feel led, will actually have their own smudging kits and smudge simultaneously, even though they're not face to face. But we'll get more in detail into that, because that's exactly the type of flexibility that we need to discuss today. And it's not something that you can impose on everybody, and you have to respect that. Certain levels of protocol, you still need to do it in person, right? So anybody else would like to pitch in?
There's another series of questions, and I'll just read it all and combine it together.
Sure.
How long does it take to build relationships? Is there different discussions that are longer or shorter than another? And they ask that because sometimes there's projects that require a very quick turnaround. How do you deal with that?
So I'm gonna let Holly talk on this in a minute, because I want her to give the Indigenous side. But I have a serious issue with quick turnaround projects. I think that Indigenous relations is a practice that has historically been left till the very last minute when it's absolutely necessary to check that series of boxes, right? But the reality is you can't wait till you have documents to be signed, or you need permits, or the relationship needs to be sincere and needs to precede the negotiation. Otherwise, there is no point. Then you're faking protocol. The important thing is that as a member of industry, that you engage early, and you engage, for instance, the people that I engage with whether there is a project going on or not. That's my job. My job is not just to obtain signatures. My job is to build relationships, to include the people's interests in the design of any project that might come along. Holly, do you want to add to this?
Well, that's exactly it. I was just thinking of, all the different people that I've worked with. And of course, I've worked personally in my businesses, like with cross-cultural consulting and doing Indigenous awareness sessions. But also in the community, when I've hosted all these big, community forums and panels and discussions and open houses. And but even when we do, fun things like Elders Christmas Party, I remember many times I would be emceeing the Christmas party, and we'd invite not just our elders, we would invite, our leadership as far as chief and council and our industry partners. And it just seemed funny to me every year because, I could look out, and we'd have this conversation. We could look out And we know who's there because they actually enjoy being in social things with us. And I can think even back of people who you see at the kids' science fairs, who you see at funerals, who you see at treaty days. And, you know, if somebody in the community is not feeling well, I remember one time I had surgery and I had people send me flowers, and they didn't have to, but it was just like that whole, like they cared. And I just feel that that is such a big thing. And to say, well, how long does it take to build a relationship? I mean, it's a question that, you know, there's no answer to, because, I mean, building a relationship with Lisa or Scott or Jorge could be totally different. There's different dynamics in that. And so we have to be really careful of saying, okay, there's this step, and this step, because there really isn't. And, you know, I think so many times too, as far as relationship building, you know, I know that there is legislation around that, as far as, you know, UNDRIP, the treaties, Section 35, and all of those things. But I really love to see when people aren't doing it because they have to, but because they want to. It's not just professional, it's personal. And I know that sometimes it's difficult to think that because you've got business and you and I like a quick, fast work ethic. But when we do that in community, you know, it doesn't work. It's just different. There's a different pace. It's a different relationship building, especially for remote areas. Like if you're in a community that's, you know, a little bit further away, tucked away, you know, down that dirt road, there's not that downtown mentality. And I've seen people fly in from downtown Calgary, then rent a car, drive all the way out to our community, and they want business done now. And I'm like, it's not going to happen. We don't know you. We don't know you. There's tons of companies. There's tons of people. We just need to build that relationship.
So building relationship is essential because it shows that you care about other people's interests. That this is not like something you're buying. You just name the price, I'll pay you, and just give it to me. That's not it at all.
Because my daughter and I, Jorge, as you know, she's a lawyer, and she practices Indigenous law. And her and I were talking about this, and we were just having, you know, we're working kind of in the same field, and we really love to share our experiences, and you know, we think of positive outcomes and solutions, and we try to keep it positive. But you know, one thing that we did, you know, share with each other is there's a lot of tokenism where people, you know, want to build relationship, and you kind of know when it's not, you know, the right motive. Like,
Yeah.
she can see it, I can see it, so I'm sure other people can see it as well, right?
Yeah, of course.
Jorge, it's Joe again. Sue Cardinal had a comment that I'll just summarize that today every community within the First Nation Métis settlements have a consultation office or a community website. So it's easier to reach out even before you know of a project and start building your relationships. Start planning now for down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to start. That's a very, very good comment. And prepare yourself. You know, earlier one of the panelists also said, you know, do your homework, chat with people. You have the web. Go look, show interest. You know, when I've worked for so many companies where every single community that had land or that were near our assets, we would actually create community profiles so that we could actually know about the history, what they had gone through, who their heroes were, historically speaking, etc., because, and protocol, obviously, because that just shows that you care, that you're not there just to do business, but that you're there to have a conversation with human beings that just like you, right? One of the main things that I would like to add, and I'll let other people talk about that, is that learning about people is not the same as learning from people. And so, Lisa can actually tell you, when Lisa and I started working together, we were working on a relationship, on a project that was in Treaty 8 in northeastern BC. And we had only talked to these people over the phone through the BC OGC, etc. So it was just, there was no personal relationship. I mean, the tone of, I mean, it was very polite, but the tone of voice used over the phone, etc. You couldn't see the voice, the faces of the people. It was just so distant and disconnected. And then we decided, Lisa and I, that we would drive up the Alaskan Highway, and we went all the way to Prophet River, and we met in several of the communities up there, Fort Nelson. And when you're in person, you're actually having the conversation. Within a day or two, all of a sudden the conversation changes completely. I don't know if you can maybe add your impression, Lisa, on maybe the first time that we went to visit the people at Prophet River.
Yeah, I absolutely, like I said, I've been up here for 25 years and I'm still building relationships, because that's even within the communities, and also it does take time, and that visit up to Prophet was wonderful because it allowed me to meet with Chief and some of his counsel, and it allowed a relationship. And I think when we live in such a world now where our social media construct is so easy, so our availability of communicating just like we are right now is still, it's so prevalent, but it's that face-to-face when we can, of course, in the middle of a pandemic, it indeed does strain the relationships, but there's still ways around it, as we will talk later. But it's also that face-to-face connection where you can genuinely admit your emotions and admit your caring, is when I've truly built the best relationships, and which have lasted for the last 25 years.
It's, I recall not just in that area in Fort Nelson, I discovered that too. You go to one of the festivities maybe that is open to the public, like a Treaties Day celebration or a powwow, and you attend and you go there, and all of a sudden, before you can even make a move towards building relationship, you're being offered a bowl of moose stew, for instance, or a piece of bannock, and all of a sudden you realize that you're being treated as a human being, and that triggers in you, that face-to-face knowledge triggers in you a desire to reciprocate, right, to do the same thing the other way. So yeah, face-to-face is so important in building relationship, and this is good that we're talking about it, because it'll click, this about the obstruction. So I want to move on, because I'm aware that we've already been an hour, and this is time for us to maybe start talking about disruptions. And I wanted to invite Holly again to talk about, and maybe I don't want you to tell us the whole story, but I just want you to maybe share with us what your mother went through when she was taken to residential schools, and what that did, losing that contact with protocol, with her community, with her daily routine, etc., what that did for her identity. And then later on, we'll start when we talk about solutions. Maybe you can tell us the end of your mom's story, which is a very beautiful end. but maybe now you can maybe share with us, what happened with her protocol, or all her identity as an Indigenous woman or little girl got disrupted by the system.
Yeah. So my mom was raised north of Fort McMurray in Fort McKay. Back then they lived entirely off the land, and we have to remember that our culture is directly linked to the land. Everything came from the land. All of our food, shelter, clothing, tools, toys, medicines, everything came from the land. That's why we are land-based people. And when we talk about culture, we're directly, communicating the land. And so she lived there, didn't speak a word of English. There was no store. She had never seen a white man. But when my mom was 6 years old, the RCMP came. It was Christmas time, and they took her and her two sisters by dog team on the frozen river by force, kicking, screaming, crying, peeling their little fingers off, the grip, and took them away. And, when that happened, the community had no idea where they went. The families had no idea where they went. And they had no idea why they were taken. And the community grieved for days. And then they were told, if you ever see anybody coming down the river, you better go run and hide, because they're going to take you. And I've heard that from many First Nations on reserve. If a strange car pulls up, kids know the hiding place because they're afraid that they're going to take them. And so, this is where the hurt and the anger built in. So my mom went many miles away to Girard Indian Residential School. She spent the next 13 years there. And the stories that we hear that come out of Indian Residential School are extreme neglect and abuse. And that's what happened with my mother. And when you're 18, your funding runs out. So you get a bus ticket out. And I remember I was teaching up north, and I ended up at her mission, and I was like, Mom, I'm at Girard Mission. And I FaceTimed her, and I was like, let's walk around. And boys were raised in one building, girls were raised on the other. Both those buildings are destroyed. A lot of people destroyed residential schools in, they're trying to wipe out the memory, but also like they're healing, just to get rid of that. And I remember there was this little shed, and she goes, see that shed? That's where I taught school. And I was like, what did you mean you taught school? And she said, well, there was no teachers at Girard Indian Residential School. And so the older girls would teach the little girls reading, writing, arithmetic. And so what happened with that is when I was leaving, she said, tell me when you cross the big wooden bridge. And then so when she crossed that, I said, well, it's right beside the school. And she said, no, it's way far away. And I said, no, it's right by the school. She goes, that's as far as we went. We thought it was a far ways away. But that's as far as I went in 13 years. But when I was 18, I was given a bus ticket, put on a bus, dropped off on the streets of Edmonton. No education, no money, no safety net, nobody to meet her, no self-esteem. So how do you survive that? So residential school in itself was horrific. Taken from your family was horrific. And being dropped off on the streets of Edmonton. And so this morning I had two webinars speaking specifically about that, showing my mom's video. And, one thing that when I go across the nation and I teach, just a lot of people say to me, for one thing, that's horrific, that her story's horrific. But I can't imagine someone knocking on my door and taking my children. And coming in and taking my children. And it was a law. If you're an Indian child aged 6 to 16, it was mandatory by law for you to attend Indian residential school. And the other thing is, how do you survive after that? How do you become parents? How do you move forward? The reason we call them Indian residential school survivors is because 50% of the children didn't survive. They didn't make it back home. The other thing is, if you survive, 90% of Indian residential school survivors ended up with a mental illness, depression, anxiety, addictions to more severe forms. And so that's why today we have Orange Shirt Day, where we're just bringing the awareness, because, you know, this isn't ancient history, this is our story. The last Indian residential school in Canada closed in 1996. And it's not, as a matter of fact, the Chief Justice, Beverly McLaughlin, and the United Nations has defined it as a cultural genocide. And I'm the second generation of a cultural genocide. So how do we move forward from that? And I would say this is a disruption. That is a disruption from our culture. You know, and when we always have to go back in order to move forward. And when I think of when Europeans first came over, like missionaries, explorers, fur traders, everybody, they couldn't live in one of the harshest countries in the world without assistance. First Nation people really provided all our ingenuity and technology and friendship. So Europeans depended on First Nations. Europeans depended on First Nations. And that was the original relationship.
Yeah.
And I'm hopeful. I believe that we've turned a corner, that we can have that original relationship. But there were so many policies within the 150 years of colonization and unilateral decision-making by the federal government that we ended up, you know, in a place that we have a severed relationship. And so building this kind of relationship goes deeper than just a business deal or a contract or a signing. It goes beyond that. It's a huge picture, right? And so that's why it's really important to have the conversations about what happened, because most people don't know. They're like, what the heck? Like, why are we wearing orange shirts? Like, what is residential school? Why are Indigenous people having conflict with, you know, industrial development? Why are we talking about it in politics? You know, why do we have to have this conversation on webinar? And it's, I think, you know, we have to take the time to look at the history of it.
That's really good input. Thank you, Holly. You know, and as you're talking, it just reminds me of, you know, going back to the idea of protocol, that the protocols, we all have protocols in our lives, and that the protocols that are more social protocols and are exemplifying the values of the societies that we live in are part of our identity, defined our identity. The certain you know, routines or rites that we practice on a regular basis are very much what form our values, what form who we are. So when you are all of a sudden facing a disruption, when all of a sudden following a protocol or following certain cultural practices is not allowed, you're actually telling somebody that their culture is dead, or their culture should not be alive, that they are denied. You know, imagine not being able to speak your language, etc. You know, not being able to be yourself, you know, because of protocol disruption. Really, really, really sad. Scott, I don't know if you want to add anything to disruptions, maybe from your experience with the regulator, if you ever experienced something as a disruption because of changes on legislation, etc.
Well, it's a disruption maybe in a different sense. So when Holly was relating the story of her mother, what was crossing my mind was, and it kind of goes back to our earlier conversation around the relationship, and what companies, and I think people who are listening are probably wondering, is when you go into a community, the people you're interacting with are trying to get a measure of who you are and who your business is, and they're kind of weighing it against a long history of events and disasters and disruptions, as we're calling them. So it's a matter of how you show up in the community. And so when my experience through the regulator was, we actually went out in a process that I was leading, where we were looking to build a new way of creating regulations, and we were having a discussion with a number of Indigenous communities, and there was protocol involved in ceremony, and what in the end there was a change in the direction of the regulators. So they decided that they weren't going to follow that initiative. So basically they just took the initiative and put it on the shelf. And that in itself was a disruption that kind of went counter to all of the protocol and all of the ceremony and all of the personal investments and investment is the best word, the personal involvement I had in the project and the people that I had with me on the project. And it was really hard to take. I'm not going to lie. We had invested not only our time and effort in the project, but we had sort of taken that step with the people in our group. We'd done, sweats, and we had done feast, and it really highlighted to me that when you do some of these things like a protocol, companies or organizations can't follow you. You're on your own, and you have to try and carry that back into your organization in a way that carries some weight. I think I kind of wandered a little bit on that question, but that's kind of where my mind was going when I was hearing these different threads.
Yeah, that's a very, very good input, because it reminds me of something that I learned from a wise elder that I've done a lot of work with. And he said, it's not just the people's minds that need to be changed, that need to be educated. It's not just the individual that needs to learn about protocol and the importance of respect, etc. We need to change the systems. So even if we were to change everybody, the system itself needs to also be purged, right? Because even if we convince some people of the value of it, until the system and this idea, and this is a theme for another webinar perhaps, but when we talk about colonization, right? Most people who are not Indigenous don't understand that their way of thinking and their way of behaving is the product of having been raised in a colonizing mentality. And so, from white supremacy to the way we do business, etc. Like, for instance, the course that I'm taking right now at Banff is on project management, but it's not about applying just Western styles or Western procedures on project management. Is about understanding that a different culture has a different way to look at a project, etc. So, and sometimes when we are working in a group, some people say, but there's centuries of science behind the way we do things, and so we take that as being a superior way of doing things, instead of taking the time to go, okay, so how would you do it? Let's see why it's different in your case. So this open conversation that is going to allow for for a change, for a systematic change, not only on the way we think, but on the way that we do things. Collaborating. I don't even use the word inclusion anymore, because inclusion implies that you have a more important culture and that you're allowing this other culture, less important, to get included or assimilated into yours. And so I think that what we need to do is we need to start collaborating and working together from a more leveled perspective, right?
Yeah. Jorge, if there's one thing I could add that just came to mind, is that we've oftentimes in the regulatory system, or even in the government system, or in the industry system, we think about the project, the thing we're building, as the end product. And what we need to do is think about the relationship as the thing we're building that will allow us to do that. So the focus is now on the interaction, the relationship, as opposed to the transaction. And right. That was something that my colleagues and I worked very hard with within the regulator, and we made some progress, but I'm not there anymore, so I can't tell you how it's going now.
Right.
Yeah.
No, and that's a very, very good point. But when you compare the way that we do things here to places like, for instance, some Latin American countries where the majority of the population is indigenous, so the voice is louder and the culture is permeated. So the indigenous culture has actually taken over. In fact, for instance, in many countries in Latin America, instead of speaking pure Spanish, in many places, half the words are indigenous. So even though you might be fluent in Spanish, you go to this other country, you have no idea what people are talking about. So that's how strong the indigenous presence is. And when companies work in some of these countries, if a proper conversation and a proper relationship that, like you say, should be the main aim, the ultimate aim, if that project all of a sudden, based on the relationship, shows that it doesn't respect the interests or meet the interests of all the parties involved, companies just don't carry it on. There is no fight, there is no taking it to court. People go, we respect that. But because of that respect, mutual respect, there is more collaboration when it comes to projects. So indigenous groups are included in the discussion. Are invited to the discussion way before the project is even started, or even a concept is started. So yeah, the way that we do things still has a long ways to go. I wonder if maybe, Joe, there is some question or some comment from the people that are online that we might want to include in this conversation.
Just give me 1 second here. There's just a comment from Sherry Boudreau that Holly, her family's from Gerard as well.
Nice.
Oh.
No, I have no other comments at this time.
No, right on. Excellent. So we'll invite people to talk more about that. So let's actually dig a little bit further before we run out of time about this COVID-19 and adapting protocol. So, and it's obvious, how has the pandemic changed protocols? Obviously, because we cannot, unfortunately, visit people face to face in most cases. I'm still lucky enough that I have some contact, physical contact with some of the communities I've met, maybe not in the community, but with members of the community. I've been able to visit some communities during this, obviously following careful processes not to make anybody not sick, but also not to make them afraid, right? There is no point in bringing fear to anybody. But other than that, I've been able to meet maybe some people outside and maybe outdoors. During the summer, we had a few meetings, keeping a long distance meeting outdoors, and that was lovely. But obviously with winter, we won't be able to do that as much. But any other thoughts on this, maybe from anybody? Lisa, any changes that you've seen in protocol because of the pandemic?
Well, I've just been, as soon as the pandemic started, reaching out to the communities I have relationships with and ensuring that their communities have, what they need. And if some of the communities are quite remote, and just kind of keeping that relationship building and ensuring that, if however our community can help, we're there. But it's definitely been a lot more challenging, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So without even talking about relationship building or interaction right outside of the community, for instance, a protocol or a series of or different protocols that have been affected by the pandemic has to do with elders, right? So we know that this COVID-19 has been lethal to elderly people or people with compromised immune systems. And so the communities have become very, very protective of their elders. And so how do you all of a sudden, how do you protect the elders from being infected by a child from the community that happens to attend school? Or right, or how do you protect your elders in the community that still cannot cook for themselves, or that they cannot go to the pharmacy to pick up their medication, etc. And so in many cases, the relationships, the pre-existing relationships that I had with some of these communities has allowed me, through some of the clients that I have, to maybe finance programs to deliver medication, right? Or to buy disinfecting products so that anything that goes into the home of an elder is disinfected before the elder touches it, right? Or for instance, creating a system whereby elders still get a chance to talk to children or to talk to younger members of the community and keep that protocol that is so important, this contact between elders or older people in the community and kids. Any other examples? Holly, do you have any examples from your community?
Well, I know that a lot of communities are totally shut down. As far as, communities that are like at the end of the road, we have security gates and they are not letting anybody in or out. Like even if I leave my cottage here and go up there, I have to have, even though I'm from Fort McKay, we have a really small community. We have to check in and get a security clearance. We have to get a medical clearance as soon as we get there. We have to go through the kind of to the health center. They come out with their hazmat suit, give you a swab right away, and it's on lockdown. And so, nobody can go in or out. And as far as, for example, we're producing a couple of films right now, and we're trying to do business and move on, and we're doing some really great projects up there now, but we can't go to the communities and film, so we're just adjusting to what we can do, what we can't do. We're totally like giving people mics and plastic bags after they've been sterilized. Everything's masks and gloves, and we're just really careful about the distancing and all of that. And it's just a way of respecting. I think too, Lisa made a really good point, like checking in on your communities. And you know what that shows them? You're more than business. I've had people come to me and say, does Fort McKay need masks? Because we can donate some. And we're like, yeah, we do, actually. And I thought, wow, that's nice for them to reach out and say, it has nothing to do with them. They're not benefiting from that at all. They're just like, here, we'll give you some cases of masks for your community. And, or just different things like that, where there's generosity that, I mean, we haven't been here before. We don't know what we're doing. Everybody's learning from this pandemic. There's new rules, there's new way of adapting. And so I just think that, we have to think out of the box and to do things, to shift our thinking, to pivot it in how we're, reaching out to our communities that we engage in.
Thank you so much for that. One of the things that stood out for me in your comment there was that we should see this as an opportunity to strengthen that relationship, right? That even though there are certain protocols that cannot be followed anymore, that cannot be followed the same way, that doesn't mean that you cut the relationship, right? That you still use this as an opportunity to show that you actually care, that the relationship is in fact the more important thing, right? Because so many projects have stopped. So does that mean that we stop communicating with these people? And of course, the answer to that is no. Anybody else? Scott, do you have anything to add?
Well, like I say, I haven't been doing a lot of interacting myself since, I left the regulator in January. And that was just before the pandemic sort of reached its shutdown. So I've been pretty quiet on my front. But it does strike me that this idea of being in a supporting role where you're providing what's needed because you actually care about the communities you're involved with. That's
Right.
that's critical in as you mentioned, in maintaining the relationship, but it also gives a really good measure of who you are and who your company is, to say, it's we're here to make sure everybody is okay. And I think that's a pretty strong message that companies and organizations and regulators and governments need to sort of take to heart.
Yeah. That's very good input. Thank you so much. So I'm wondering if at this point, I could share with you, like I did earlier, about how people are having virtual smudging sessions, or that you can still pray with other people to open meetings, even when you're doing them over Teams or however other method. That you can still, for instance, if you know somebody in the community that has access to tobacco, before you check with an elder, if you feel that it's appropriate to give a tobacco offering, which is the proper protocol when you're addressing an elder to do something at a meeting, even if you cannot go into that community yourself, you can still send some money to somebody from within the community for him or her to present the tobacco offering on your behalf. So that's an example of adaptation, right, to protocol. And in view of what's going on, most people go, yes, of course, we will accept the tobacco from somebody else on your behalf. So maybe at this time, what I'd like to do is maybe open it to even the participants in the webinar, or even the panel members, on questions that you might have about, so how do you do this now that we cannot be in person anymore? Or how would you look after this protocol? Or maybe you have some experiences that you would like to share with the rest of the group on adaptations that you've actually experienced, either because of COVID or because of other impediments to protocol. So maybe I'll start with you, Holly. Do you have any ideas of have you heard of any communities adapting protocol because of COVID?
Well, I know that we are a meeting community. We're meeting with people all the time, and we're not meeting. And, I do have to say, though, one thing personally for me, adapting to this pandemic is, we've all been at home. We're all stay at home, right? And we're all in that mode right now since, March. And, because we were at home, we watched in horror as George Floyd with the knee on the neck, and how he was murdered on that hot street, and we just watched in horror. And what happened with that was a lot of protests, and this is where Black and Indigenous people have always stood in solidarity. There is the acronym Black, Indigenous, People of Color, and so we've really been having these great conversations and about race. And what I have been doing is leaning in on these conversations. And personally myself, I do this for a living, so I'm a little bit, interested in it, of course. But I've been listening to, if there's any panel on TV, I PVR it. I watch them a few times each. I write notes. I've been listening to podcasts. I've been looking at YouTube, so I have audiobooks, and I've been leaning into all these conversations because, even a racist will say, I'm not racist. But how we have to move forward is be actively anti-racist. But what's going on, and I've noticed this a lot, is that people are saying, well, I don't really think I think I'm okay. But we have developed unconscious biases. And this is really important when you're working in communities, when this gets back to normal, when you're visiting the communities. I hope that we're all different. I hope that we're not using microaggressions. Microaggressions are little tweaks. And I had a question about that this week, and I've been asking a lot of my Indigenous friends, what are microaggressions that you experience? Well, there's tons of them. And then I started thinking about microaggressions that I have used. And, you know, and we have to like do like a change and learn and just realize, yeah, maybe I've made mistakes in the past, but this is a really good time to lean in and to grow and to learn, because there's so much available to us right now. There's so many great things that are happening. And, you know, when we talk about, you know, the truth and reconciliation, part of reconciliation is the truth. So, you know, I would say that during this pandemic, this is a really good time to learn, to learn, to give yourself the gift of how can I grow and improve. And sometimes it's uncomfortable. You know, racism is ugly, and all these conversations, you know, they are uncomfortable, but maybe we can start doing that self-reflection, and I've been doing it myself. And so I that's one thing that I would, you know, um, contribute that has been really beneficial for me during this pandemic, is that I've been learning and listening. I've been actively listening to these conversations. Even when you guys are talking, I've already written a bunch of notes on the wisdom that you have been sharing with me. So I'm very thankful for that.
Thanks, Holly. You know, and as you talk, of course, um, I'm also reflecting, you know, on this. You and I have had this conversation many times, right? This unconscious or microaggression examples that we all experience on the receiving end and on the giving end too every day without even noticing. Uh, so maybe this would be a good time to start, you know, to go back to your mom's story. And if you could tell us briefly, how did your mom adapt after, you know, after having lost her identity and not knowing protocol anymore? What were some significant structures or steps in her life that led her to adapt to the new person she was, or to relearn maybe who she was at the beginning?
Yeah, so it's such an interesting story because it's always like a cliffhanger. People are like, "You left us on the streets of Edmonton. Like, what happened?" Right? And um, you know, it is actually a really good story because my dad was a geologist, and he was doing early exploration work in the Athabasca oil sands when it was just basically the boreal forest back in the, you know, 40s and 50s, and he would hire Fort McKay First Nation men. They go to work for him by dog team, and instead of eating the camps, they snare rabbits for lunch. And um, uh, those were all her cousins that he hired because they knew the land so well to do the early surveying. So we don't actually know how or why or when or what, but my dad went looking for her in Edmonton, and he found her, and, you know, they built a relationship, and he's talking about relationships, and he was saying, you know, I know about you. I've heard the stories about you. I know all your cousins, and I can take you home. I can reintroduce you. And, you know, love healed my mom. Honestly, that was a great love story. And the thing about that is my dad was cultural. He was adopted by the Brave Dog Society of Siksika, and he was, you know, a pipe holder, and he was very much into those, you know, ceremonies from here in Treaty 7. And what happened with that was he ended up uh, really soaking my mom in the culture. And, you know, she really had a great resume. She was doing some really cool things. As a matter of fact, she started giving back. She was Volunteer of the Year of the City of Calgary one year. But her greatest legacy, I think, was she saw a whole bunch of kids in child welfare, not just from, you know, the ripple effect of residential school, but the scoops. From the 60s to the 80s, it was coined the 60 scoop. They were still taking children. So all these children were in resident or in child welfare. So my mom opened the first home in Canada that was for Indigenous children, that was run by Indigenous people. And we saw 2,000 kids come through the program, and mom totally was like, I know you have therapists, but we're going to bring elders. You can smudge. We're going to teach how to drum, dance, build regalia. You can powwow all weekend. They went to a cultural survival school. And my mom said, I know when you're 18, you're out of the system. Let's go find your families. And if family's not doing good, we'll hook them up with the resources. And so, my mom, she's constantly telling me stories of, oh yeah, that person I mentored them in this way, or this person, I mentored them in this way. And because I saw that, I saw her success, I realized that anything was possible for me. See, success breeds success. When one of us makes it, there's a whole bunch of youngins watching. And so that's what I love about that story, is that, it is a sign of hope and moving through. Now, some families, it may take a couple more generations. And I'm not saying this is perfect at all, and it was a lot of work. But it is multi-generational work. A lot of our people are still wounded and hurt by the historical trauma. And so they may be projecting it onto you when you go into communities. You're working with them, they're like, you damn guys, you white guys, you know what you did to us. They're talking like that. Or they say things like, you know why we don't like snow? It's because it's white and on our land. Like I don't say that. They say that. But I just want to, realize that we have this historical trauma, but I don't really want to be seen specifically entirely by our struggle. I want to be seen by our successes.
Right on.
And, I think that we should stop saying, what can I do for Indigenous people, but start saying, what can I learn? And you said, Jorge, learning about is different than learning from. And also, Scott, you said collaborating, interaction, not transaction.
Right.
And so these things, can we be seen as viable business partners? And, Jorge, from going to the Banff Center, we know that Harvard University did that Native project where they looked at successful Native Americans, Canadian Aboriginals, and they looked and they said, what made them so successful? And there was two things. Well, this is Holly's paraphrase version of it, but there was culture and economic development, but they were always hand in hand. Right. And so culture and economic development, that's how we're going to move forward. And when we have companies like yours that participate with that and look at us like, how can we collaborate? How can we work together? How can I be allies? We're moving forward in Canada, and it just makes that story like my mom. Maybe you might not have that grandiose opportunity like my dad to marry and have a love story, but maybe you're going to have like the little conversations around the water cooler, around your kitchen table. If someone's talking negatively about an Indigenous person, community, or issue, let's change the narrative. But how do you do that? You have to learn the truth first and start doing your own homework and learning, right? And right. So preparing yourself for those conversations.
Something that's so beautiful, Holly, something that you reminded me of, and you and I have had this conversation that, after I attended the Truth and Reconciliation Summit a few years ago now in Banff, I came out of that whole experience with exactly the same feeling. Yes, it was extremely sad. I cried, for days. But I also came with this idea that is not just truth and reconciliation, is truth, reconciliation, and truth. Meaning there is this truth that we can no longer deny of what happened. Then there is the reconciliation that comes through relationship, proper relationship building, right, and accountability. But also there is a new truth there here, and all these interruptions to protocol are a perfect scenario, a perfect opportunity, like you say, for us to write a new truth about the people in Canada, Indigenous and settlers. Really learn how to write a new chapter in history, right? So I always talk about a new truth. It's not just truth and reconciliation, it's truth, reconciliation, and new truth. And so maybe having conversations with people. And so, just for those of you who are still waiting for the magical answer on how do you adapt to protocol, or is it appropriate to adapt to protocol? And many First Nations will have serious issues trying to adapt protocol. Many protocols, most protocols, are literally sacred to the community. So it is very important to recognize that sacredness in the protocol. And if you need to adapt, or if you feel that you need to adapt to protect people or to build a better relationship, that you just ask questions. This is a great opportunity for you, even though there might not be a project, for you to reach out and talk to people. So what is the value behind this protocol? How can you, instead of you trying to adapt it, ask people, invite people, what would you need to adapt this? Is it worthwhile adapting? Is it respectful adapting it, etc.? Very important, that you recognize not just that this is, like you say, Holly, this is not just a hindrance to protocol and to relationship building, it's also an opportunity. It's also an opportunity. Joe, I just want to make sure that we're not missing anybody's comments or questions.
Yeah, there's a few questions. If elders are the main source of wisdom or protocols, what is the best method to start the conversation with the community in the time of COVID-19? Without you, because you don't want to put the elders at risk.
Yeah, that's a very good question. When again, I'll let the other panelists talk about this a little bit, or maybe there's other people that want to comment on this, especially if there are people from the Indigenous community online that would like to give their input. Please do so, because we would like to hear what you have to say. But this past summer, I had the privilege of meeting with two elders over a cultural piece that was being done for a major oil and gas company here in town, and we had the opportunity of doing them outdoors, and we kept a distance, and we were being very, very safe about it. But we spent a whole morning talking to these two elders about a specific protocol, so that people understand it is essential that we always respect the fact that approaching an elder already has a protocol. So if you've never done it before, communicate with somebody in the community, get a hold of somebody in the community and find out what the proper protocol to approach an elder is first. And then if they agree to do so, you have to follow the protocol, and it's most of the time it involves an offering, or it involves a certain prayer. It changes from community to community, but there are certain things that you have to follow. So it's better if you learn to appreciate, first of all, what the protocol to approach an elder is. All the knowledge is held by specific people within the community. Not all knowledge holders are elders either. So there are very specific positions within some communities that people are, for instance, labeled, or they hold the chair of being a knowledge holder without necessarily being an elder. So you have to be aware of that. It changes from community to community. The best thing that you can do is, again, see if you can actually do it electronically. Like we've done other sessions of joining youth with elders or with knowledge holders, either at open spaces or via the internet. So I don't know if anybody else has something else to add, but that's a very good question. That's something that very few people are doing these days because of COVID. But there is other ways. We have electronics. The challenge there is that most elders are not very familiar with how to use a computer. So you'll have to maybe perhaps have somebody in between helping you. But I mean, I remember the days not long ago when many elders didn't speak English, for instance, and so I still needed a translator. So there is ways to adapt, right? Ways to adapt. Anybody else wants to add anything to this?
The only thing I would add is that you, in going into maybe you'd like to speak with an elder, but it's also up to the elder whether they wish to speak with you,
Right.
and whether you have actually demonstrated that you're worth speaking to, I guess.
Right.
So it's a nice aspiration, but it's not like you follow the 3 steps and then you're in the door. It's actually part of building a relationship is actually working with the community even before you have an opportunity to speak with an elder.
Right. Yeah, they're very good. And the same goes for, you know, prominent figures, for instance, like chiefs, right? Just because being a chief is not just a political position, it's a cultural position in the community too, right? So you can't just go knock on the door of a chief and feel that they're going to open their doors, you know, no matter who you think you are. Yeah, that's a very, very good point, Scott.
And I
Please
think,
go.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
Go ahead, Holly.
you know, a lot of times people say, well, what is an elder? Like, is it that magic birthday that you know, turn 65 and overnight you're an elder? And, you know, elders traditionally were any age, any gender. And the reason is because we didn't have an alphabet, we had oral tradition. And so you had to sit over and over and over and listen to the stories. And then as you were groomed, and also you proved yourself, then you could be someone who transferred the knowledge. That was typically what it was. And when the Indian Act came in, we had government. I mean, as a matter of fact, the United States of America was inspired by an Indigenous model of, you know, around the Great Lakes area. The Confederacies of the Six Nations was an inspiration to Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, those guys. It was a template for politics. But we had really strong, you know, legislation, politics, governance. But when the Indian Act came in, they said, no, let's forget about all that. You'll do European style governance. So they said, well, you'll have 1 chief per First Nation, 1 counselor for every 100 Indians, up to 12. So chief and council will be like a European style election of votes, and then they'll serve 2 years. Well, you can't do much in 2 years. It didn't go so well. So most of us are changing our governance code. So as far as, you know, communities, they're extending the term. Also, they're incorporating the traditional governance that we had. So we have hereditary government, we have youth government. And so when we talk about consultation, it's not always the elders.
Right.
Somebody mentioned earlier that there's some kind of industry relations corporation in every community, which would be the one window approach, but not every community has that either. And so, you know, it may be the business people that are the best approach, chief and council the best approach, the youth. Maybe it's someone you're building relationship with that answers the phone, who knows everybody in the community. You know, they know whose dog that is, they know who's kissing who, who's fighting with who, they know everything. And so they're a good source for, you know, your contact. But, you know, make sure that you're inclusive, because most communities have, you know, strong family groups. And so make sure that you're just not favoring towards one family, that you're inclusive. And it's like in my community, we have Cree, Dene, and Métis in one community. So we have to make sure that we're including all 3 groups. That's part of relationship building. So I think that we have to realize it's not cookie cutter, and it's not like, well, let's approach the elders. Again, it's really doing your homework and the business. And, you know, I wish that there was, like, you know, a magic. This is the manual on how to do it. And, you know, I actually, in my training, have a full, like, tips and do's and don'ts and proper protocol and how, you know, not to appropriate culture. But I think, you know, I always go back to the main thing is doing your homework, listening, and building relationship.
Good for you. That's really good. And not being cookie cutter, but I mean, Building relationships with Indigenous communities is no different than building relationships, period, right? We're all people. So I don't understand why we need to make a difference there. You know, we have to make sure that we start from that idea that, so how would I start a relationship with any community, not just Indigenous, with any culture that I don't understand, with any group, you know, that I don't understand. I am very, very conscious of time here. We only have maybe 7 more minutes, 8 more minutes to go, and I don't want to leave anybody with, you know, that fantastic question floating there. So this, I'm not sure, Joe, if you were going to be sharing this, a PDF form of this presentation afterwards, so that people have some access to information, but there is tons and tons of stuff that you can use to continue this conversation and continue the learning. These are some, there's some other very good sites that will give you, if you have no background on Indigenous protocol or in Indigenous culture, there is tons. These are more or less some of the ones that most people use, but there's tons of other sites that I could be sharing with you. So you know, feel free, Joe, to share my email address here at CWL with participants that might want to maybe dig a little bit further and ask for references on or other sites. Is there another question, Joe, that that maybe is burning in your screen?
Well, I just had there's a comment from Ron over at the Enoch Cree Nation that they're holding off on elder engagements in person for now, but they're continuing engagement with their staff. And then there's a question. It's a long one, but I'll try to shorten it. Do you have recommendations for engaging with Northern Indigenous communities that are asking for face-to-face meetings at this time? They don't want to bring COVID from the south to the north, or vice versa, and they don't want to bring fear to the communities. But they don't want to offend anyone either by not accepting a face-to-face meeting. What are your recommendations?
I think, I would like to imagine that everybody's going to agree with this, that this is not, that these people should really not be afraid of saying no. I mean, this COVID-19 is a serious illness, and we know how many older people it has killed. Recommendations such as having conversations through somebody else, through somebody, as if you want, I'll call it a translator, even though it's not a language issue, but having some sort of ambassador that could communicate internally and then phone the people or communicate via internet with the people that are interested. I think that is very important that we respect people's fears, especially when we don't have the magic answer as to how to prevent COVID, right? And yes, we know that there are several different opinions on the severity of the illness. The bottom line is you have to respect the way people feel about it. So if we have the technology, I don't see why we cannot do it virtually, right? Anybody else would like to add some input to that?
We were just talking about this with my daughter and I again. We're talking about this in her law firm. They have a really strong Indigenous law group, and we were sharing that a lot of communities, it's business as normal. They're plowing through it, and COVID, they just adapted, became resilient, and I think it's honestly, we've gone through tough things. We are tough people. Like, we just are like, yeah, we want to keep going. We want to keep moving forward. We're in a momentum, and we're going to we can do meetings that they're safe with. I have had meetings on First Nations where they were totally safe with, very much distancing, masks, sanitizers. If they feed you, it's individual plating. You know, but people are doing business still. And, you know, again, it would be like Jorge said, taking this pandemic seriously. We don't want anybody to get sick. But also realizing that we as Indigenous people have already gone through so much. There's this resiliency in us that are, you know, we work through the hard times. And we see that even through this pandemic, that there is business still going on. And so I respect that and I appreciate that of our people.
Anybody else, Lisa or Scott, would like to add something before we close the session?
I just think, speaking to that, I don't think in this in this climate that anyone would be offended by you not wanting to have a face-to-face meeting, and it's all about collaboration. So however one can ease, you know, community's fears, then, and you still want to you know, get work done, there's always a way, but it's all about collaboration and respect.
Yeah, well put. Scott, any final thoughts?
I would completely agree. I've actually just recently done a training course for a number of Métis leaders, and we did the same thing. It was a beautiful facility, Métis facility, actually out at Victoria, the Métis Crossing, and it was a beautiful building. We had the ability to distance and sanitize, and like you say, individual plating and all of those things, and it went very well. It was it's really speaking to the individuals and the people who are involved and where they're coming from, no different than any relationship with anybody. So it's just about actually applying a little bit of common sense. If it works, if you can make it work, then you can do it. If you can't make it work, then you go to an alternative.
Right on. Well, with that, and because it's almost at the top of the hour here, I would like to express my gratitude, not only to you, Joe, for allowing us to use your organization, the Environmental Services Association of Alberta, as a means to have this event, but also to the panelists, Scott, Lisa, Holly, my dear friend. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you so much for being part of this conversation. And please, I think the last slide there has contact information. If anybody wants to get a hold of us with comments or questions, or if you need any guidance, or you want our humble opinion or anything, or you need to get a hold of somebody else through us, please feel free to contact us. And again, to all our participants today, thank you so much. I was humbled by the number of people that registered to this. So thank you so much for being part of the conversation. And I'll pass it back to you, Joe.
Thank you, Jorge, Holly, Scott, and Lisa. I think this is extremely valuable. Something my parents always taught me was about relationships and how important relationships are. It's never about you, it's about the other person. It's about you know, building that community, and I think we've lost that along the way. Holly, could you share that video link with me so I can share it with people about your mom's story? I'd love to share that story. It also struck me today. I mean, I got up, I watched the news, and I didn't realize it was Orange Shirt Day. I can't believe it wasn't on the news, and it just seems to, you know, I didn't even know, so I went and changed during one of your presentations, put my orange shirt on. So I hope someday it becomes a holiday like they've talked about. So again, thank you, all of you, for doing this. I really appreciate it. I think this is very, very valuable for all of us. It's important, again, relationships. And with that, the video will be available later once it's processed. I'll send out an email to everyone. Thank you again, all of you. Stay safe. Be happy.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.